We have to read the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death by the American poet Emily Dickinson. This is the second part of Module 2. There is a companion piece which is an essay by the celebrated critic Cleon Brooks. The essay is interesting in itself, but it is not so easy, I am afraid. So I thought it would be a good idea to begin with a poem which is considerably simpler. But our purpose is not to read and enjoy the poem. Rather, it is to get a clear idea of how to approach a poem or, for that matter, any literary piece. Just think, you have read a good number of poems and stories in the last 12 years of formal schooling, I am sure. Usually, we follow a very traditional method. The teacher or the text introduces the poem comprehensively. Usually, we get a lot of information about the author, his or her preferences, experiences, political positions, ideological moorings, etc. And on the basis of this information, we read the poem. Of course, there is nothing wrong with that. All the methods are valid, but for the time being, we are concerned with approaches which can roughly be called formalistic. Here, the focus is on the text. Well, before that, let us have a look at traditional methods. Remember one thing, traditional does not mean obsolete. These methods are still very much relevant, and I would say these are more productive than a textual formalistic method. That is my personal position, but for the time being, we will focus on the formalistic school. Well, we will read them quickly. We are not going into the specifics and details. Okay, just be aware of these methods. One is historical. After historical, I have typed contemporary America. This happens because Emily Dickinson is an American, and if you want to approach her poems historically, you should have a thorough understanding about America in the 19th century. Now, another approach is biographical, which is very close to historical method. In this method, you focus on the personality of the author. As a matter of fact, Emily Dickinson was a reclusive. She led a secluded, lonely life. So all these things come into play when you follow biographical method. The third is called social or sociological. Remember one thing, slavery was a very powerful social institution those days, and women didn't have the right to vote. They were second grade citizens, they were marginalized. So, when you take all such details into account, you are following sociological or social method. Well, you can approach this poem in terms of the contemporary political sensibility. There were a lot of thinkers, they were very much bothered about the individual's right to lead the kind of the life that he loved. So there were vibrant political thinkers like Emerson and Thoreau. You can take their views into consideration if you want to follow a political approach and if you want to offer a political reading. Then you can approach the poems of Emily Dickinson within the frameworks of philosophical approach. Here, I think the word that can help us much is transcendentalism. As I told you, I am not going into any kind of explanation. You can Google the term transcendentalism and it's easy to understand. So you can approach this poem on the basis of transcendentalism. Then, finally, there is a religious undercurrent. Emily Dickinson belonged to a certain Christian denomination named Calvinism. Calvinism is named after John Calvin, who was a Protestant theologian. They are a unique church. I don't think Calvinists are present in Kerala. Maybe there were 100 years ago, not any longer, I think. The Calvinists, theological doctrines and views of Calvinism had their own influence on Emily Dickinson. So there are so many ways in which a poet can be approached. There are so many ways in which a poem can be studied, and I have enumerated just 6 of them. There are different, there are more of course. Like you can have a theological approach, you can approach the poem in terms of gender or class, Actually, theoretically, the number of approaches is unlimited. So we have just familiarized ourselves with 6 methods. All of them are extra textual. They take historical, sociological, psychological, and philosophical ideas into account. It is true that in writing literature, in composing a poem, all such elements go into it. Poetry does not exist in a vacuum. Literature does not exist in a vacuum. Actually, literature is very much historical and socially embedded. So there is no denying that such elements are absent in literature. But the question is, are these elements directly presented in a literary work? No. All the social events and impressions and feelings and emotions and political currents do find a place in literature, but they are presented in a different form. They figure in literature through a process. In order to get things in perspective and to understand things better, let us use a metaphor. The metaphor of a potter. Potter, as you know, is a person who makes artifacts and utensils using clay. So here clay is the raw material. But can we say that a pot is equal to clay even though clay is the material? Can we say that a statue is equal to clay simply because it is made of clay? We cannot say. Clay is there, but we do not call a lump of clay a statue or a figurine or any artifact. An artifact is born through a process, just like literature is born through a process. And what are the defining features of this process? In many respects, the poet is like a potter who breaks and kneads clay. A poet plays with words. A poet takes words from his own repository or from a dictionary, but he changes them, he molds them in such a way that they achieve new meanings. Just like a potter may add water and color, the poet adds new meanings to the words. Just like a potter may add chemicals and other preservatives into the clay, the poet invests every single word with new layers of meaning. And finally, there is a shape to which the raw material is molded. The potter makes, as I just told, statues and figurines or whatever she likes. Just like that, words are broken and kneaded by the poet so that a poem is born. Even though a poem is made of words, a poem is not merely a big bucket of words. So it's clear this is a creative process. It is not easy to achieve. A poet is a creator because by putting together so many already existing words, he creates something new. So the bottom line of the argument is that the text is the result of this creative process. So we must focus on the text, not on the forces and factors that have gone into its making. In other words, even though the life experiences and political sensibilities of the poet and his age are important, even though such things have gone into the making of a poem has its own existence. Just like a statue is different from clay. In formalistic approaches, a poem is complete, organic, and autotelic. A poem is complete. That means you cannot add anything into it, you cannot take anything from it. Even the removal or addition of a small amount will alter the overall quality of the poem. It has got a perfect, complete existence. Now, a poem is considered organic. And what does it mean? That simply means a poem is like a living organism, just like a human being. It has a life of its own. And a poem produces its effect through many factors. One is semantic tension. There is always a tension between different meanings, and there are paradoxes, there are ambiguities, and there are so many metaphors, figures of speech which make a poem a poem. These are the defining features of a poem. And a poem is autotelic. That means it is absolutely independent and autonomous. You need not worry about history and politics and psychology of the reader and the writer in order to appreciate a poem. As we have already understood, all these things are there, all these things go into the making of the poem, but a poem is still autonomous. It is autotelic, it is organic, and it is complete.